Hello everyone. This is the last of the class examinations. This is, as always, intended for use with improv, for those who have never played the class and are looking for some build inspiration, or for those who don't have any of the items for this class. But this is the last one because this will be the last class that we haven't gone through, and then after this I'm going to be switching over to the focused build series of endgame builds, and then go along the line there. So this is our final Grim Dawn class examination. And after this, we'll be talking about more specific builds, but the Oppressor is something that a lot of people see as being focused around vitality, because essentially, broadly speaking, you have two different options. You can go with Harbinger of Souls, increasing your vitality and aether damage, or you can go with Path of the Three, increasing your vitality and poison damage. But what if I told you there was a way you can get a pretty effective Divine Mandate Oppressor in here? Observe. First off, obviously, we're going to be going with Divine Mandate, and then you really want to go into the Guardian of Empyrean, go for Celestial Presence. Keep in mind there's a bleeding resistance reduction there. Alright? Now, out of Necromancer, there are primarily two skills that I go for with a Divine Mandate Oppressor. The first one, and this is extremely important, is Spectral Wrath. This reduces enemy physical resistance. This gives you an aura that does aether and vitality damage, which is a really nice supplement to your fire and physical damage, because, of course, fire and physical are going to be decently resisted by certain ethereal heroes, bosses, etc., who are going to have decent physical resistance. They're going to have some amount of elemental resistance. It can get a little tough against ethereals. So the vitality damage out of Spectral Wrath is extremely nice. And also, of course, Chthonics have a tendency to be resistant to fire, so having the aether damage for them is a really nice thing. It's only a damage over time, and it is an aura around you, so it can be a little tough to get this to work with ranged Divine Mandate Oppressors, so I do very heavily lean on melee whenever I play one. But it is extremely useful, and you can notice a difference. If you've played with, say, if you've played a Oathkeeper Demolitionist and you've gone through these areas, then you probably know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about resistances. But if you go into a Oppressor and you bust out Spectral Wrath, you will notice it's a little faster to eliminate them. Besides the fact that it also reduces physical resistance, which is very nice for the Divine Mandate Oppressor, because of course one of their main damage types is physical. Now, whether or not you actually go into Siphon Souls depends on how much you need the splash of vitality and bleed. That's totally up to you. Again, this is more geared towards melee. I just want to point that out fairly continuously, because really, honestly, a Divine Mandate Oppressor really wants to be melee. It's not to say you can't use it with ranged, but the problem with ranged is, if you're ranged, enemies aren't in range of your Spectral Binding, obviously, right? Your Spectral Wrath, they're not in range of that. And they're not going to be in range of Siphon Souls. And while normally you could use those on enemies that run up to you in melee, your Guardians of Empyrean are going to be distracting your enemies to some extent, so you're never going to really catch all the enemies in the fight necessarily. Exceptions to this are if you activate a shrine or a totem. Obviously they're just spawning all around you, and that's a totally different story. But nevertheless, it is much more difficult to get those two abilities to work as effectively as they could if you were melee. Beyond those two abilities, beyond Siphon Souls and Spectral Binding, of which Spectral Binding is definitely the more important, you can pretty much play the Oathkeeper or build the Oathkeeper however you normally are comfortable with, or try something new if you really want to. If you want to go into shields and grab Safeguard for the bonus damage, Aegis of Men here, maybe Vire's Might if you're going into the Shattered Realm, you know, that's fine. Or if you just like Vire's Might in general, that's fine too. You can do that. If you want to go into auto-attack focused build, you can go into Righteous Fervor, you can get Smite and Shattering Smash, you can Splash and Reaping Strike for some energy and health regen. I mean, you've got Spectral Wrath, so why the heck not, right? You can absolutely do that. This is about the only other exception I'll make. You can go into Necrotic Edge. That's also fairly effective. You can splash in some elemental damage increase rather than pure fire increase, but you don't have any benefits for cold damage, whereas Spectral Wrath is reducing enemy resistance to Vitality and Aether, so I typically find Reaping Strike to be more useful, and I almost never build Necrotic Edge, even if I'm building an auto-attack focused Oppressor. So just keep that in mind, but I do sometimes use Reaping Strike with an auto-attack focused Divine Mandate Oppressor, but you do have that option as well. You can go into that. You could choose to not use a shield and go into Judgment if you really want as well. You could spin to win with Eye of Reckoning and your delightful Spectral Wrath. You could absolutely do that as well. That's fairly interesting. You've got all of these other options, but the Oathkeeper side of this, build how you are most comfortable doing so, and then just splash in Spectral Binding, and maybe Siphon Souls, maybe Reaping Strike. If you are going to go with a ranged Divine Mandate Oppressor, I do strongly encourage you to go into an auto-attack focused build, because you can pull off Righteous Fervor here, go into Reaping Strike, and if you use a shield, you can use Aegis of Men here to force enemies into a melee range, or force select enemies into a melee range, so you can use Spectral Wrath on them, which turns out to be fairly effective. You can also do this with melee, but with melee you typically are going to want to run up on them anyways, but with Aegis of Men here, you can basically say to about half dozen enemies, hey, I want to individually pick you off while my guardians are distracting everyone else, boppity bop. Okay, now you're in range of Spectral Wrath. So there is that as well, but that is generally how I approach Divine Mandate Oppressors. So now let's talk about Path of the Three Oppressors. Now, the Path of the Three Oppressors, I run one of two ways. First off, I pretty much am always going Ravenous Earth, Decay, and Foul Eruption. There's a couple of reasons for this. First off, obviously, we're increasing our poison and vitality damage. That's obvious. So this does vitality and poison damage. This does vitality and poison damage. This does vitality and aether damage. The aether damage is just a freebie to help you deal with Chthonics, but it does 10% reduction to enemies' health more as it levels up. And this is really effective. I love this to pieces. So you have that. That's very potent, and it's something you are almost always going to want in a Path of the Three Oppressor. Now, where you go from there really depends upon whether, again, you want to go with auto attacks or abilities. I also will point out that I usually still go with Scion of Dreeg, Celestial Presence, Poison Acid Resistance, Vitality Resistance. It's very delightful. Now, how you actually run from here really depends upon how you really want to approach this. If you want to be ranged, you can actually get away with that a little bit more easily, because Ravenous Earth will really pull its weight. You can go into Righteous Fervor, Dreeg's Reproach, and use your distance shots very potently. And then from there, if you really wanted to, you could go into Reaping Strike if you really wanted to, because you're increasing vitality. You could go into Necrotic Edge, rather than going into Smite and Shattering Smash, which you would if you had a shield, right? If you were melee, let me rephrase that. If you were melee and had a shield, I keep forgetting that that requires melee as well, because I usually use shields with melee. I don't usually use shields with guns. Just a personal preference of mine. So you do have that option as well. You could alternatively go into an ability focus, Aegis of Men here, Aegis of Thorns for that poison acid damage, and then maybe you want to go into Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath again. Maybe you want to go into Siphon Souls and Blood Boil because you're forcing enemies near you again. And that's also very effective. These are generally the two ways I primarily build this. I don't often go into Drain Essence, because even though it is fairly effective, I usually am going to default to Siphon Souls for that. And that's generally just how I prefer to play. I don't use this a ton. It makes you stand still. You have to interrupt yourself to cast Ravenous Earth a lot of the time. It's a bit troublesome. But that's usually where I will go with this, is one of those two things. Sometimes you'll go into the melee weapon and the shield, and you'll want to go into these anyways, and just do this weird combination of poison, acid, vitality, fire, and physical and internal trauma. That can work. You're dispersing out your damage a little bit more, and I think personally in the Path of the Three build, the poison acid damage isn't as well resisted by the chthonics and the cannibals enough where you really need to diversify your damage types, especially since you do have a bit of a tickle of aether damage. If I am going to diversify my damage output, I am going to usually go into Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath for that aether damage, for a bit of a boost in the aether damage department. And of course, again, as I've stated before, I am rather fond of Siphon Souls, and the auto-attacking version of this, I usually rely on Reaping Strike and Necrotic Edge for that, rather than the shields, just because both of these do vitality damage, which is being enhanced by your Path of the Three. So that's usually how I will approach these. For all of these builds, I just want to take a brief moment to mention, if I'm going to be building Presence of Virtue, either I'll go all the way out to Haven if I'm using a shield. I won't necessarily go with the Rebuke, it depends on if I'm going with the Retaliation build. But I'll usually go to at least Haven, but a lot of the time I'll just build Presence of Virtue for the energy. If I'm going with an auto-attack build, I probably won't even build Presence of Virtue, because with auto-attacking you don't necessarily need a ton of energy. A lot of that is very cheap energy-wise. You've got basically Righteous Fervor costing a couple of energy per auto-attack, and of course the random triggers such as Smite or Reaping Strike, they don't cost any mana at all. Furthermore, Reaping Strike drains energy, so if you're going with an auto-attack build and you have Reaping Strike, there is no need for Presence of Virtue. I will sometimes go into Resilience. I will go into Resilience if I am using Reaping Strike or Siphon Souls, because it's very important for those to help keep you alive, and Resilience can really help with that. It gives you some other excellent benefits as well, such as an increase in your resistances, some extra defensive ability. It's just a really nice thing to have. I don't really go with Ascension a whole lot. I will only go into Ascension if I am a melee, retaliation-focused Divine Mandate Oppressor. That's quite a mouthful. And that is somewhat of a specific build. We'll talk about that when I get to the focused builds with the final sets for the Oppressor, but this isn't something that I use a whole lot of. It's just not that effective. I will sometimes use it with Divine Mandate Oppressors, but that's about it. I don't usually use it with Vitality-focused Oppressors, which is most of them. So this isn't something that you're going to build a lot of. If you really want to go with a Retaliation build, it's fine to go into this, even with a Vitality-focused Oppressor, but I just don't find it that useful overall for those situations. And of course, Judgment is basically the non-shield version of Aegis of Men here, except in melee range, with a, I think it's up to a 10-meter area. So, yeah. But if you're going with Path of the Three, Ravenous Earth, absolutely. And then what you want to go into beyond that is totally up to you. Now, I don't usually go into pets with the Path of the Three Oathkeeper. I'm usually focusing on myself, and it's a similar kind of situation with Harbinger of Souls. Now, whether or not you actually want to go all the way up to the Scion of Dreeg Guardians really depends upon your personal preference. I sometimes do under the Harbinger of Souls. The problem I mostly have with this is that you have to put all 50 points in here to really make them worthwhile, and that's very expensive point-wise, so I often don't. I'll be really honest. Sometimes I do, but more often than not, I'm saying no, because it's too many points to devote to that. Usually, well, with the Harbinger of Souls, I am almost always going to go here. I won't necessarily go into Ravenous Earth. If I'm going into the Scion of Dreegs, I will get Ravenous Earth. But if I'm not, I basically am using the two hand in hand, because under Harbinger of Souls, at the very least, it's not necessarily worth it. Basically, what you're... a lot of the same things that apply to the Path of the Three Oppressor applies to Harbinger of Souls, but with a couple of differences. First off, since you're already at the Path of the Three, you already have the 50 points, the Scion of Dreeg is incredibly useful, and you definitely want to go into Ravenous Earth. Maybe you go into Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath if you really want to. You'll probably go into Siphon Souls. Alright? Under the Harbinger of Souls, you're definitely going into Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath. You're not necessarily going into the Scion of Dreeg. And you are maybe going into Ravenous Earth and maybe going into Siphon Souls, but you are much more likely to be using Drain Essence instead. And maybe Reap Spirit if you're really into that. Okay, that's basically how that goes. You're just basically changing what is absolute necessities and what is not. Also, I am much less likely to use the Aegis of Thorns under Harbinger of Souls because this is pure acid damage and physical damage. Whereas Dreeg's Reproach, Righteous Fervor, at least does do some vitality damage, and it is nice to splash in some poison acid damage if you want to go with a Harbinger of Souls auto-attacking focus. You can 100% go into Righteous Fervor, Dreeg's Reproach, Consecration here, good old Retribution, and then go into Reaping Strike, Necrotic Edge, bust out your Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath, and basically have a field day. Alright? That is a lot of how these run. You're basically just changing your focus. Again, it's mostly about the vitality damage with both of these. It's just changing what your secondary damage type is, whether it's Aether or Poison Acid, and it changes, at least slightly, what abilities are need to have and what abilities are not. Now, before we close out this video, I do want to talk about pet-focused oppressors, because they do exist, obviously. You've got good old Master of Death. And you would, go into your skeletons, you would go into your Blight Fiend. Now, this is a fairly interesting thing here in that you have a couple of different choices. You have roughly two choices. Okay? You can either, let me put it this way. We put in Master of Death, right? We max our skeletons. In all ways, we maximize our Blight Fiend. In all ways. Right? Now, when I typically play this, I'm going into Spectral Binding. Going into Guardian of Empyrean. Scion of Dreeg. Celestial Presence. And then at this point, I'll usually bust out a couple points into Reaping Strike, but this is only with what I would call a 100% pet focus, because these all do vitality damage, and obviously the Blade Fiend does Poison Acid, so Celestial Presence will really benefit your other pets. But you don't necessarily need to go into these, because they don't scale with pet bonuses. So if you don't feel like going into them, that's totally fine. You can go with a really excellent hybrid build. Now, when I go with a hybrid pet oppressor, right, I'm usually going to go into Righteous Fervor, good old Dreeg's Reproach, Consecration, Retribution, and then I will spend my last couple of points in Reaping Strike, and then put my last point here. Now, the reason why is because all you really want to do is stand amongst your own pets and reduce the enemy's vitality and Aether resistance. That is primarily what you're doing here. So that way your skeletons can do more damage, your Blight Fiend can do more damage. You basically have free reign to wail on people with your Righteous Fervor and Reaping Strike, because your Blight Fiend with Rotting Fumes and with Blight Burst is generating so much threat that a large amount of the time he will be tanking the enemy damage. So you're pretty much free to do whatever you want. Now, again, you have another option. You don't necessarily need to go with auto attacks. It's simply my personal preference. You can 100% go into basically whatever else you want. And the only reason you really bust out, by the way, Dreeg's Reproach here is because you want to convert that fire damage to vitality damage to take advantage of the Spectral Wrath. There's enough damage output here. Even though vitality is still your main damage source, your skeletons are doing other damage types with the elemental damage from the skeleton mages. Of course, you've got the poison acid from the Blight Fiend, so you do have other alternatives. But if you want to instead do some other thing, like maybe you want to be an ability focused hybrid, maybe you want to go into Aegis of Men here instead, maybe you want to go into Ravenous Earth instead. I just really like the auto attack focus, because I can get an increase in my resistance, in my armor, and I can do some decent damage through just Righteous Fervor with Dreeg's Reproach and also Retribution, while still boosting the damage my pets are doing via Spectral Wrath. And this is just how I personally prefer to play it, but you can go with any combination of abilities. I have been known to use Drain Essence for a similar function, staying alive and staying nearby while my pets wail on the enemy. That's also very effective. I don't usually use Ravenous Earth quite as much under a hybrid build because it doesn't really help keep you alive as much. The Righteous Fervor, Dreeg's Reproach, plus the Reaping Strike really can help keep you alive a lot, especially since Dreeg's Reproach does increase your attack speed, which means more potential for Reaping Strike to activate. So you do have that, but usually I'll go into something that'll help keep me alive. I've also been known to go into Siphon Souls, but that's very rare because, frankly, between the two of them, Drain Essence does a bit more damage because of Spectral Wrath, decreasing the resistance to both its damage types. So, with that being said, this is generally a majority of the ways I approach the Oppressor class. If you like this, please like and subscribe. Thank you all very much for joining me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, requests, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below. And have a great 24 hours.